Something is happening inside the Catholic Church that most of the world has not yet noticed. 13 days from now, in a small Swiss valley at the foot of the Alps, a ceremony is planned that could split the Church more openly than it has been split in decades. And the man who saw it coming, who warned and pleaded and finally acted and then died, has been in his grave for 35 years. His name was Marcel Lefebvre. And if you have never heard of him, stay with this, because what he warned about, what he lived for, and what he ultimately died believing, is arriving now in a way that even his most devoted followers did not fully expect. If this kind of hidden history matters to you, the stories Rome does not put in the headlines, take a moment and subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming, and they deserve to be heard. Marcel François-Marie Joseph Lefebvre was born on November 29, 1905, in Tourcoing, in the north of France, a city of mills and textile workers, a city that built things to last. He was the fifth of 8 children in a family of deep Catholic faith, and by the time he was a young man it was clear that his life would be given entirely to the Church. He was ordained a priest in 1929. He became a missionary bishop in Africa. He served as apostolic delegate to French-speaking Africa and was Archbishop of Dakar. He attended the Second Vatican Council as a voting member. He was no outsider. He was not a dissident by temperament. He was, by any measure, one of the most distinguished churchmen of the 20th century, which is why what he eventually did shook Rome to its foundations. Because Marcel Lefebvre did not grow suspicious of the Church's new direction from a distance. He watched it happen from the inside. He sat in the council chambers during Vatican II from 1962 to 1965, and what he witnessed there troubled him in ways he would spend the rest of his life trying to articulate. The council, he believed, had allowed a foreign spirit to enter, not the Holy Spirit, something else. He came to call it the spirit of liberalism, the spirit of the revolution. In his book, An Open Letter to Confused Catholics, written in the early years after the council, he described what he was seeing with a clarity that was almost clinical in its calm. The altars were being demolished. The tabernacle had been moved from the center, hidden to one side. The Mass itself had been transformed almost beyond recognition. The prayers that generations of Catholics had memorized from childhood were being dismissed as mere repetition, as if the recitation of sacred words was something to be embarrassed about. The number of priests was collapsing, convents were emptying, ordinations were falling. And yet, he wrote, the men responsible for these changes spoke of springtime. They spoke of renewal. Lefebvre did not see a springtime. He saw a flood. He wrote plainly about what the statistics were showing. Dramatic declines in baptisms, in confirmations, in the number of monks and nuns and schools. He asked for one thing first and foremost: truthfulness. Truthfulness about the facts of the present situation. Truthfulness with regard to the established teaching of the Church. In his view, the first casualty of any revolution is always truth, and a revolution had come to the Church wearing the language of mercy and openness. In 1970, he took an action that would define the rest of his life. In the village of Icone, in the canton of Valais in Switzerland, he founded the Priestly Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX. Its purpose was simple and, to his mind, essential: to train priests in the traditional rites and doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, to preserve what had been handed down, unchanged, from the apostles through the centuries, to refuse to let the ancient Mass, the Mass of the Ages, the Mass of Trent, be simply erased from the face of the earth. Rome watched with concern, then with growing alarm, then with condemnation. But Lefebvre did not stop. He continued ordaining priests at Icone year after year. He continued forming young men in the traditional liturgy, the old catechism, the full and unabbreviated faith. And he continued speaking, writing, preaching, making his case not with bitterness, but with what he believed was the urgency of a physician watching a patient bleed out, while other doctors argued over the color of the drapes. By the mid-1980s, he was in his 80s, and he was looking at a problem that would not wait. The SSPX had no bishops. Bishops matter in the Catholic Church not as a matter of prestige, but of survival. A bishop ordains priests. Without a bishop, a religious society cannot perpetuate itself. It can only watch as its priests age and die, and the work of decades slowly vanishes. Lefebvre needed to consecrate a successor before he died. He knew it, and Rome knew he knew it. Negotiations began. There were moments of near agreement. On May 5, 1988, Lefebvre and Cardinal Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI, signed a protocol that seemed to open a path forward. Under its terms, Lefebvre would receive a bishop of his own choosing, and the SSPX would be regularized within the Church's canonical structures. For one brief moment it appeared that the wound might be healed without a rupture. Then the moment passed. The very next day, Lefebvre wrote to Cardinal Ratzinger expressing serious reservations about the agreement. He had consulted with his own bishops and with his conscience, and he had concluded that the protocol did not offer real guarantees. That what was being offered was not a true preservation of tradition, but a controlled containment of it. That if he signed and submitted, the SSPX would be absorbed, managed, and eventually dissolved, kept alive in name while being transformed in substance. He believed he had seen this happen to other movements, other communities. He would not allow it to happen to Icone. On June 29, 1987, at an ordination mass, he had already said publicly what was forming in his mind. He told the assembled faithful that Rome was in the darkness of error, that the bishops of the world had largely embraced a direction incompatible with the faith, that before he went to give account of his life to God, he would likely have to act. And on June 30, 1988, he acted. At the seminary of Icone, in the presence of approximately 10,000 faithful and hundreds of priests and religious who had traveled from across the world to witness it, Marcel Lefebvre consecrated 4 bishops without a papal mandate. He was joined in the act by Bishop Antonio de Castro Meyer, the elderly bishop of Campos in Brazil, who shared his convictions entirely. The 4 new bishops were Bernard Tissier de Mallaré, Richard Williamson, Alfonso de Galarreta, and Bernard Fallet. In the sermon he preached that day, Lefebvre explained his reasoning in words that his followers have returned to again and again in the decades since. He spoke of what he called Operation Survival for tradition. He said plainly that placing the SSPX under the authority of Cardinal Ratzinger would mean putting themselves in the hands of those who wished to draw them into the spirit of the council. He invoked the state of necessity, the ancient theological and canonical principle that in a genuine emergency, when the survival of souls is at stake, normal rules may yield to the higher demands of the faith itself. He was 82 years old. He had spent nearly 60 years in the priesthood. He had served in Africa, in Rome, in Switzerland. He had watched the church he loved change around him in ways that felt to him not like development, but like dissolution. And he made his choice. The Vatican's response was immediate. Pope John Paul II declared that all participants in the consecrations had incurred automatic excommunication. The document Ecclesia Dei was issued, acknowledging that there was a legitimate attachment to earlier forms of the Roman Rite and calling on bishops to accommodate it. A concession that Lefebvre's supporters viewed as a partial vindication, even in the moment of his official condemnation. Lefebvre received the news of his excommunication with what those who were present described as a kind of settled calm. He did not recant. He did not rage. He said what he had said all along, that he was acting under necessity, that the faith was in danger, and that history would judge. He died on March 25, 1991, on the Feast of the Annunciation, at his seminary in Martigny, Switzerland. He died excommunicated by the Church's official reckoning, though the SSPX and its supporters have always disputed whether the technical conditions for excommunication were actually met. He died without hearing Rome say that he had been right, but his followers believe, and have believed every day since, that the Church's subsequent history has been saying it for him. Consider what happened in the years that followed. The Latin Mass, which Lefebvre had essentially gone into schism to defend, was gradually rehabilitated. Pope Benedict XVI issued Summorum Pontificum in 2007, acknowledging that the old Mass had never legally been abrogated and allowing it to be celebrated freely. Benedict XVI lifted the excommunications of the 4 bishops Lefebvre had consecrated in 1988. The SSPX was given special faculties for confessions. Its marriages were recognized. Slowly, carefully, The distance between Rome and Icone was being bridged, not because the SSPX had yielded, but because Rome had moved toward it. Then Pope Francis issued Traditionis Custodes in 2021, restricting the Latin Mass sharply once again. The process of rapprochement stalled. The SSPX remained in an irregular canonical situation, functioning, faithful, growing, but without full communion with Rome. And then, on May 8, 2025, Robert Francis Prevost was elected Pope, taking the name Leo XIV. The traditionalist world watched carefully. Leo XIV was seen as more sympathetic to tradition than his immediate predecessor. There was, for a time, real hope that the SSPX's decades-long situation might finally be resolved, that a regularization, a canonical recognition, might at last be achieved. Those hopes collided with reality in February 2026. Father David Pagliarani, the SSPX's Superior General, announced that the Society would consecrate 4 new bishops on July 1, 2026, again at Icone, again without papal mandate. The Society's 2 remaining bishops were aging. One bishop had died in 2024, another in 2025. The arithmetic of survival was the same as it had been in 1988. Without new bishops, the SSPX could not continue ordaining priests. Without priests, the traditional Latin Mass communities it served around the world would slowly die. Pagliarani invoked, explicitly, the same state of necessity that Lefebvre had invoked 38 years before. Cardinal Fernandez met with Pagliarani at the Vatican in February 2026. The Vatican proposed structured theological dialogue in exchange for a suspension of the consecrations. Pagliarani refused. The Vatican's conditions in the SSPX's reading did not offer what Lefebvre had always said could not be offered: real guarantees, not managed containment. On May 13, 2026, Cardinal Fernandez issued a formal statement declaring the planned July 1 consecrations a schismatic act that would entail automatic excommunication. Pope Leo XIV asked the SSPX to reconsider. He warned publicly that the ordinations risk deepening the schism. As of this week, 13 days before the date, the SSPX has not stepped back. The Society issued its own declaration in May, addressed to Pope Leo XIV. Its language was careful and firm. They stated plainly, "We have no other desire than that of living and being confirmed in the Roman Catholic faith." They noted that all discussions entered into had remained without result. They framed the situation not as rebellion against the Church, but as fidelity to what the Church has always been. It is language Marcel Lefebvre would have recognized. It is, in many ways, his language. What his followers see now is not a crisis born of stubbornness or pride. They see the final proof of what he warned about for decades, that the post-Vatican II structure of the Church cannot, on its own, preserve what must be preserved. That the men who hold authority are not always in a position to exercise it in the service of tradition. That there are moments, rare, terrible, necessary moments, when fidelity to the faith requires acting against the instructions of the men who hold office, because the faith itself is larger than any office. They see July 1, 2026 approaching not as a defeat, but as a confirmation. Not as the Church breaking apart, but as the prophecy of a French archbishop, made over decades of preaching and writing and suffering, finally arriving in visible, undeniable form. Whether that reading is correct is not for this channel to judge. What is documented, what is real, what history records, is this. Marcel Lefebvre spent his life warning that a crisis had entered the Church, and that it would not resolve itself without cost. He paid that cost himself in 1988. He died under excommunication. And now, 35 years after his death, the institution he founded is preparing to make the same sacrifice at the same place on a day that is almost but not yet, upon us. At Icone, the Swiss valley at the foot of the Alps, the seminary he built still stands. The chapel where he ordained hundreds of priests still holds its masses. The graves of priests he formed are in the churchyard. And 13 days from now, if nothing changes, 4 new bishops will be consecrated there without the blessing of Rome. Lefebvre called it Operation Survival. His followers believe the operation is still running. Whether Pope Leo XIV and Father Pagliarani find some path through the next 13 days that neither has yet announced, Whether some negotiation is still possible that the public does not yet know about, that remains to be seen. The history of this moment is not finished. But this much is finished. The story of Marcel Lefebvre, the French boy from Tourcoing, who became a missionary, a bishop, an archbishop, a founder, a schismatic, a prophet, depending entirely on who you ask. The man who stood in a Swiss valley in 1988, at 82 years old, and consecrated 4 bishops into the teeth of a papal prohibition because he believed that without them the ancient Mass and the ancient faith would not survive. He believed that what he was doing would be understood eventually, that the Church, having wandered, would find its way back to what he had preserved for it. That history, moving slowly as it always does, would vindicate the choice he made on that June morning in the mountains. History is still moving. The verdict is not yet in. But July 1st is 13 days away, and in the valley of Icône, the preparations, by all accounts, continue.